I'm Ann Dark.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to episode 118 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. We have an interview today with Liz Freeland, who is the author of An Orphan of Hell's Kitchen.
The youngest of 4 children, Liz Freeland grew up outside of a very small town in East Texas in pre-Netflix days. The first loves in her life were animals and Humphrey Bogart. Had it not been for a father who kept a house full of books and some tireless elementary school teachers, she could have happily remained an illiterate rabbit caretaker, addicted to black and white films on the Late Late Show. She now lives with her husband in Montreal, where she astounds locals with her makeshift French, where she writes and does freelance editing. An elderly cat or dog, or 2 or 4, can usually be found in her apartment, and during the busiest day, she can often find time to sneak in an old movie. Liz also writes as Elizabeth Bass and Liz Ireland. An Orphan of Hell's Kitchen is number 3 in the Louise Faulk series. In 1914, Hell's Kitchen is an apt name for New York City's grittiest neighborhood, as one of the city's first policewomen, Louise Faulk, is about to discover when the death of a young prostitute leads her on a grim journey through the district's darkest corners. Filthy, dangerous, and deadly, Hell's Kitchen is no place for a lady. But Louise Faulk is no ordinary woman. The amateur investigator turned rookie policewoman is investigating the death of young prostitute Ruthie, who leaves behind a baby boy. Although detectives are quick to declare it a suicide, Louise is less certain after she discovers clues implying murder while attempting to find a caretaker for Ruthie's orphaned son.
We would like to welcome Liz Freeland to the program. She is the author of the fascinating book, An Orphan of Hell's Kitchen. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Was there an actual person who was the inspiration for Louise?
There are 2 answers to that. When I first started looking at writing a historical mystery, I was thinking of my grandmother. She was born in 1895, so she lived around Louise's time. She had come from a farm family in Michigan. She left home to continue her education when she was very young and ended up becoming a nurse. So she underwent an interesting trajectory to me, and it's always kind of sparked my imagination, always looking at her thinking, that was an interesting life. But when I started researching for this book about a young woman moving to New York City in the 19-teens, I ran across a book about an early policewoman in the New York Police Department. She was one of the first female detectives who was in the force, and her name was Mary Sullivan. She wrote a book, I think the name of it is My Double Life. I loved reading about her. It made me want to make Louise a police detective. She was very much the basis for Louise. They're very different personalities. The Mary Sullivan, who I read about, was a widow, had a child to support. In terms of her career, I wanted Louise to have a similar career.
3 of my favorite characters were Aunt Irene, Walter, and Bernice. Are they going to continue in the series?
Oh, yes. That makes me so happy that you said that. I just love those 3. I love writing the part where Louise goes to her aunt's townhouse whenever she pays them a visit. Those are always really fun scenes to write. And Irene was one of the first characters I thought of for the series. I wanted Louise to have a connection to the city. I've always loved the writers like Mary Roberts Reinhardt and Anna Catherine Green, those early mystery writers. I wanted to have a character like that who had this a literary salon according to her standards. And I love Walter, especially the Walter the butler. He's a former actor, thinks of himself as a master of disguise. I always really enjoy when he comes into a scene, but I have trouble keeping him out of the book because he tends to barge into a scene and take over. Even though I love him, always end up cutting quite a bit of Walter material that seems excessive.
We will not complain about too much Walt.
Oh, good.
I liked it when Louise would show up at Irene, and Bernice always had a little snarky comment to make.
Denise is always the voice of reality.
Always ended up with a care package or food.
Yes, exactly. She gives wisdom and food. And who doesn't need a friend like that?
We all do.
My favorite line in this book is, if the world truly wanted to arm young girls with knowledge about what to watch out for, they should sit them down for an hour with the Myrtles of the world. While there's blatant sexism running rampant in the early 1900s of the book, I think this sentiment still holds true today. Would you consider Louise to be a feminist of her time, or is she developing into one because of her experiences?
That's really interesting. I love that line from the book because it shows how far Louise has developed by the third book. When she starts out the series, she's very young. She's still very young in the third book, but she starts out the series, she's just left home and she's only 20 years old, but she's had a horrible experience and she's fleeing a traumatic experience from home and forced to leave under unhappy circumstances. I think that has colored everything that's happened to her since then, as it would. Trauma does that to everybody. As she becomes a policewoman, she starts to understand how much wisdom there is in looking at the people who had even worse experience and learning from them. She was very sheltered growing up, and I think she understands pretty quickly that you can be too sheltered. Part of that is what led to her falling into a difficult situation, I'll just say, without wanting to give away too many spoilers.
The sexism of the time also worked in women's favor on occasion. I read about Nan Patterson and Mrs. Florence Carman, who were both acquitted of murder because the juries of the time just couldn't believe that a woman could be capable of that kind of violence. Could you see Louise getting involved in an investigation of a woman suspect?
Oh, definitely. I think Louise would go after anybody she expected was guilty of a crime. She's very tenacious that way. But that's very interesting about juries thinking women couldn't commit violence. It's so obviously not the case. There were so many examples of it. That's sort of like Lizzie Borden. People thought there was no way a well-brought-up young woman like her could hack up her family.
And of course, the juries were all men. You wonder
Exactly.
if there were women on the jury, if they would have felt the same way.
It's true.
Would know how violent a woman is.
Exactly.
I think a lot of it was a little bit of class prejudice. Especially they thought rich women, middle-class women, nice girls wouldn't have done something like that. Or maybe they just didn't want to bring a scandal on their family. I was reading recently about Peggy Guggenheim's sister, Hazel Guggenheim. Possible, they don't know, but they think that she threw her 2 toddler children off of a hotel roof. They both died, but they never charged her with murder or even seemed to investigate it very closely. I guess because she was part of the Guggenheim family and very wealthy, and I think they just didn't want to touch it. Very suspicious sounding.
I'd never heard of that one.
It's a horrible story.
Fortunately, that sort of thing happens still today.
Oh, yeah.
Because of sexism in the police department during that time, will Louise continue to work for the police department or will she go out on her own?
I think Louise is pretty much committed to the New York Police Department for now. Sometimes they don't seem very committed to her, but it's definitely an important part of what she wanted to achieve in her life. She's going to continue on. She'll probably do some sleuthing on her own still, as far as I can see. She definitely has a lot of things yet to achieve. Of course, there's a running story about her thinking that her criminal nemesis, who's a gangster character, has a mole in her police precinct. She's trying to figure out who is informing for the mob inside the police. That's kind of a running story throughout the books.
In the series, Louise is of German descent, but she's defensive of her American citizenship because at the time she's experiencing some anti-German sentiment. It's before America's involvement in World War I, but they're heading into World War I. Will that aspect of the story continue as we go forward?
Oh, Yes, definitely. That was one of the things I loved about setting the series at this time. Even though the United States wasn't in the war, technically, there was so much going on in New York that concerned the war. So many German nationals committing acts of sabotage inside the United States, which I think has been mostly forgotten about. I think we remember the Lusitania sinking. There were actually German nationals blowing up things. They were poisoning horses that we were sending across the ocean to help in the war effort. There were just various schemes that they'd come up with. It heats up as Americans get closer to joining the war. This is an issue she's going to be dealing with right along. Her being German and being able to speak German, it works both ways. It helps her infiltrate some of these organizations, and it also means that she's a little defensive when people talk about German soldiers bayoneting babies, because she knows that it's probably not true. There was a lot of propaganda going on at the time.
On both sides.
On both sides, yes.
Yeah. We thought this was a very appropriate question for what we're dealing with right now. If you follow the timeline where the book leaves off, the Spanish flu is not too far in the distant future. Will Louise deal with the pandemic in an upcoming book?
Oh, well, I guess it's 4 years away from 1918 right now. It's 4 years away in Louise's timeline, but in a publishing world, that could be either next year or a decade. So we don't know how soon we're going to get there. And it could be by the time I get around to writing about the 1918 flu, then maybe there will have been a slew of pandemic books. I don't know. Maybe they'll be like the new zombie books and people will get tired of them. Never want to read them again. I don't know. If I get there, she'll definitely be dealing with it, I think. My grandmother was a nurse during World War I and afterwards. I've always been interested in the 1918 flu because she lived through that. She was a big vaccine supporter. My grandfather was in public health for Dallas County.
That's interesting. Louise gets to work with some federal agents in this book. Will that open the door for her to become a spy?
There wasn't really any kind of framework for her to be a real spy. There weren't even very many American male spies at that time. We didn't have a big intelligence setup. We'll definitely be working behind the scenes. They know where she is and how useful she could be. So I have a feeling they'll be seeking her out quite often in the next year. Because of the things we were talking about before, there's a lot of German sabotage going on around New York. Woodrow Wilson, when the war broke out in Europe, he grounded all the ships that were in the United States, all the foreign ships that were German warships, wouldn't let them leave. There were a lot of German soldiers and sailors in New York with lots of time on their hands. In fact, one of those ships, they turned it into a little bomb manufacturing site. It kind of worked against us in some ways. Louise will be looking into all of that, I'm sure.
Is it historically accurate that there were policewomen in New York City during World War I?
Oh, definitely. Even in the late 1800s, especially when Teddy Roosevelt came in, he expanded the role of policewomen. Mainly, they were babysitting female prisoners and taking care of female prisoners, transporting them, watching over them in the jail cells. She's still doing a lot of that, and she's chafing against that role. They were called police matrons up until the 19-teens, and then we're beginning to call them policewomen after that. So she's chafing against the traditional role of the policewoman, moving into more active police duties. They discovered that women could be very useful for undercover work, sting operations. The idea that they weren't using them before is just pure sexism because they had these women there ready to do all the work for them and they just didn't put them to good use until later.
I think in some areas they still do call them matrons. I have a friend who lives in Rhode Island. She does overnights at the jail for the women's prison. They call her the matron.
Oh, is that true?
So I think the phrasing is still being used. I don't know about in all areas. I know in Rhode Island.
Well, that's how they all started. I was reading, it was a similar situation in Los Angeles, too. They had very limited roles, lack of imagination on the part of the top brass of these police departments.
I think it was in maybe another interview you had that you said, I don't know who it was, they said, well, we can't have women police officers directing traffic because all the traffic would stop because they were looking at the women.
Yes, isn't that silly? But it's absolutely true. If you've seen pictures of the uniforms these women are wearing at that point. These heavy blue wool uniforms that are basically from their chins down to their heels. It's just so silly. That's how the world was, I think. Just kind of nuts.
Liz, are you working on any new books?
Yes, actually, I'm working on a new series. It's going to come out under my older pseudonym, which is Liz Ireland. It's a cozy mystery series, and it's set in the North Pole, and the sleuth is Mrs. Claus. The first one is called Mrs. Claus and the Santaland Slayings. Comes out end of September.
Wow,
So
how unique. That sounds pretty cool.
Fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It spent so long researching the NYPD and those horrible stories of what was going on back then in terms of crime and sabotage. Then I started writing this series.